everyone, I am very excited to have Ted Rau as our storyteller today. His topic is governance as a language, a pathway to interorganizational collaboration. Ted's going to introduce his professional background in just a moment, but I would like to point out that he is the parent of 5 children, which is truly leveraged his PhD in linguistics. For those of you who might be interested in co-housing, Ted also lives in one of the earlier US co-housing communities, where he shared with me that his children feel very blessed to have multiple persons they can turn to and can fill in for his parents when because they're so comfortable living there. I found a quote when researching Ted. I found a quote that he made, and I thought it was important to read it before we started this presentation. Language is about cooperation, and particularly when groups of people are deciding governance principles for their community. Who is accountable for what? How do we resolve conflict? How do we plan for the future? What issues are relevant to the individuals, and what is relevant to the group? This session will be recorded, so if any of you would not like to be recorded, please make sure and turn off your video. Our amazing storyteller is going to be talking for about 20 to 25 minutes, and after that, we'll move into questions, building on the stories that he's told us thus far. I have put a link to Mentimeter in the chat. And you are welcome to put in questions at any time, and we'll ask them at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, Ted, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. So you should now be seeing Governance as Language, a pathway to interorganizational collaboration. And I want to talk about the big dream that I think many of us have, of people all over the place working together for some sort of common goal in a pluralistic way, people who are inherently good and driven by purpose and interested in community and connection with local autonomy, and yet there's alignment for everybody. That's kind of what we're hoping for, right? On the big stage of everything. Yet somehow it's not working as well as we're hoping. Many of the systems that we're using don't quite connect, or they don't integrate fully. Like, we haven't quite figured out how to put all the pieces together. And that's why I'm coming with my hypothesis here. We learn to cooperate in groups when we use language, but to cooperate in groups when we use governance. Note that I say when and not because I don't know whether that is true or not, but I think they have to go together in some shape or form.
Ted, I'm going to interrupt you for just a moment. Since we have a smaller group of people, there's a question in chat asking how you would feel about us just taking all of the mutes off and just asking questions as they come up during your presentation. Would that be all right?
Sure. If we go light on that, that's fine. And there will also be some moment where I have some questions for you then in particular. I think it's a great idea.
Great. And just so you know, we're not seeing the full screen of your presentation, and that's fine. We're seeing your presentation and notes. We're seeing
that's
both your
unfortunate. Notes. Okay. Thank you for alerting me to that.
No
so
problem.
Here we are.
There you are. There you are.
Self-introduction. Apparently one can go back and forth. So self-introduction. I live in Massachusetts. We've already heard about that. I'm one of the co-founders of SOCIOCRACY for All, which is a nonprofit operating worldwide. We started in 2016, and we now have something like 220 members, way fewer in full-time equivalents. And my previous career was linguistics. I have a PhD in syntax semantics interface, some work around that. And when I dropped out of academia, I thought I was leaving it behind forever. And then it took me many years, honestly, embarrassingly, to notice, oh, I'm actually still doing the same thing. And that's what this talk is about. So to me, this is like a cycle of 18 years closing, or a loop coming together again. What I do full time is doing consulting and training for self-management, particularly sociology. So now let's think about how language works. So one thing that is somewhat clear to most people, at least if we think about it, right, is that language is creative. It's always new, right? Whatever sentence we say, it's likely that nobody has ever said it before. So it's always something new that we're making up. But we're always following patterns. And there are different systems that work together in language that I'll talk about later. They're all interdependent, autonomous systems. One interesting thing, and that's might not be familiar to everybody, is that language, many of us think that we learn language by imitating what we hear people around us say, which to some extent is true, but that's not how children learn so much. Because children, we know that because children say things and make mistakes that they don't hear around them. So that is an indication that they're not just parroting what other people say. There's also some predictability around what mistakes are made and what mistakes are not made. So there's this whole mystery around that of like, wait, why are some mistakes made and some are not made? Fairly independently of the input of what children hear. So language acquisition is very interesting. And one thing that happened in the 70s was that there was this hypothesis that we all have a universal grammar that we're born with. And it's that universal grammar that helps us learn language so fast, as a child at least. And that also then limits what kind of language or what kind of linguistic expressions we can even form. So it gives us a head start, but it also limits what we will be or how we will be able to say things. So now the question is, if this is what language is, this is kind of a super formal description of what language is. It's universal grammar, what we're born with. Recursion, like if I say, I see the man who's behind the tree, who's, behind the car, which is behind the car, which is behind this and that. That's recursion, right? We have a recursive pattern. And constraint, some things you can say and some things simply don't work. And then there's, of course, idiosyncratic thing that is specifically language, like irregular verbs and stuff like that. But that's not super interesting, that just is. So, but now the question is, what's the same thing for cooperation or collaboration? What is that same thing for governance? What are those deeper rules, or is there even maybe something that we're born with? If so, that would be super interesting, but I don't think it's been looked at in this way. But first, I want to look at the problem and also kind of make that step from communication to language. And that's the following way. So if we're communicating, you see those two brains, right? That's what we're really good at, right? Like there's something that you're thinking, and language and all the other things that we use are enabling us to put a thought that is inside of somewhere in me and have a representation of the same thing in your brain. It's wild if you think about it, that even works, right? And there's a lot of things at play to make that happen. And communication only gets us so far because it goes only from one brain to another brain. So it's a one-to-one relationship. And even if now you're saying, oh, but you can talk to a group. Yeah, you can talk to a group, but then it doesn't look like that. You're not talking to a group. What you're really doing is you're talking to individuals. You're just talking to them all at once, right? It's not that they form like a super brain or the collective brain, right? It's still individual brains that are listening to you individually, each having their own internal monologue about what you just said. So in a way, communication already somehow has its limitations there, but now it gets really limited. No, actually, hold on, let me start somewhere else. So now if we want to communicate to a group, for example, if you want to find the billing department of a company, you're not just yelling into a group saying like, I need to be, reimbursed. But what you need to do is you need to find the person in the organization that has that function of reimbursing. You're talking to a group, you're talking to something that has internal structure, and only because of the internal structure you're even able to communicate with that, because otherwise you'd just be talking to a group of 5,000 people that has no chance of success. Okay, so you see where I'm going with this? It's like, oh, there's governance at play here on this side so that we can even find who we're communicating with. And we have communication from a group. That's a very typical problem. Now, what is that piece that lets us all speak with one voice? You want about you're going to follow in a process of figuring out what that is, right? Or how to feel that. So they will need some sort of decision method by which they come to that statement, that statement. Can't just talk as a group just by using language. You will use some process, which I would call governance. There's no way around it. We just that's the glue that we need to figure that out. So now, if you want to speak from a group, we now have a similar thing. Like, let's say, for example, I'm the person who's managing the Twitter account for an organization. Then I'm not acting as one of the 5,000 members, but I'm acting as the person who holds the role as the Twitter person. So now I get to speak for the organization, right? In my function as the person who manages Twitter. So there we have the whole thing on the other side. So now just a few stories on that one, because that's so common that people struggle with that actually. So I talked about branding, or at least, like kind of your public output. Who defines the mission of an organization? Who defines the value set, right? Like, where does all of that happen? That requires a lot of process typically. One thing that I ran into recently with a client, or I should say a potential client who then didn't become a client, was the following. We had figured out that she needed help, and she knew she wanted help from me, and we knew we were absolutely on the same page about everything. And I asked her to sign an agreement, and she said, "Wait, but who am I signing this as? I know I want to sign it," she said. "I want to sign it because I want this, but who am I signing it as? Like, am I signing it as part of the organization?" And of course, this was an organization that was in complete disarray about their governance. That's why that was the problem. So, long story short, she couldn't sign because she could not figure out by which process she could make up her mind who she's signing as and whether she has the right to sign this contract for the organization. There was no process in place to figure out how she would figure out who to sign it as. And those are the things I'm finding myself in a lot, because I work a lot with kind of organizations that are in that state of governance, which is, by the way, why I wrote a book about that whole thing of who decides who decides. That's the question that so many people are struggling with. All right, but back here. So what we've found now, that in order to communicate between groups, or from a group to a group, we need that internal structure, which governance tells us how to do, right? So as I said, we contact the service department or the billing department, not the organization. Or one nice example of that I find myself in quite a bit when I answer my emails, and maybe you feel that way too. I answer to the info at our organization emails, kind of the default mailbox, which means I get all these stray emails where then I notice that it takes the longest to answer them if I'm not clear about what domain they fall in. And those are the hardest to answer. Because once you know where something lives, it's typically easier to figure out what happens with it. But just like that, without having that sense of what that structure is and where in that structure you are, then it becomes almost impossible. All right, so back here, that's still the question I'm trying to answer, right? If this is what guides language, what guides governance? What are the basic ingredients of that? So for that, I thought we'd take a little excursion into linguistics. How's language structured? And it actually is quite cool. So what you see here is this is just honestly one of those standard examples. John read a long book of linguistics with a red cover. And what we know from linguistics is that we all have in our grammar brain, so to speak, a representation that must look something like that, or at least that's a model that describes what we do. So you see there's a lot of nesting going on, right? So like there's a book of linguistics that seems to belong together, and then it's a long book that seems to modify this term, right? And then with the red cover it seems to modify that term, right? It's not linguistics with the red cover, it's the book with the red cover, right? So they have a certain way of how they belong together. And that's how it all fits together. And that's very similar to actually how an organization is structured, right? But first, let me stay with linguistics actually here. So as I said earlier, I alluded to that. So language consists of semi-autonomous systems, which is quite exciting. So you have the way things are pronounced or words are formed. You have the way there's meaning assigned to words. You have the way the order of words or phrases is figured out. We have pragmatics, which is very typically people don't know what pragmatics is. It's kind of like, what are you trying to say with your statement? And then there's text linguistics, kind of one step up. How does a text work? What are the linguistic principles that work to turn a text into something coherent? And as I said, the package that we need to figure out language is nesting, recursion, local parameters, a few idiosyncrasies. And by the way, what's really interesting, and that's what I wrote my master thesis about, was in language acquisition. And it was seeing how children start kind of here. That's what they're able to form first. And then they start to build more complex thing. And then at some point they go from phrases into sentences. And then they can form sentences and like dependent clauses and so on. But that all takes a while. So they kind of build it from the ground up. And that's also why they say things that don't actually exist in grown-up language, because we already have the full structure. We might screw up from time to time in how we say things, but we already have the whole nesting in place. So that's why children's language is different from grown-up language. So in that way, we have all these different systems happening on all those different levels. Like, what's a storyline and so on. And we learn those at different points in our lives, right? So in the first few months of your life, you learn, or even pre-birth, actually, you learn about sounds, and then you assign meaning and you put that all together. And then that's about like around age 2 or so that you learn that. And then I know first graders have a really hard time writing a coherent paragraph, right? And stories, they still struggle in 4th grade on that, like that's how long it takes. So now I want to make a little bit of a wild claim, and yet I think there's something valuable here. And that is that my claim is that this is somewhat parallel. So we might have figured out the personal level, right? And we have figured out the team level. And with Teal organizations, for example, we figured out an organization level. But what about all the rest? So I would say we're here. We're getting okay-ish at that, we're getting there. We have the tools now. We just need to pick them up more consistently. And then, but what we need next is into organizational level. Like this is fairly unclear to most people how that works. And that's what I just want to spend a little bit of time on here. Just a few ideas that I have on that one. So I would really like to figure out the parts of speech of governance at some point, but I don't have it all that clear. And by the way, Eleanor Ostrom, for those who know her, Nobel Prize winner in economics, she wrote something that she called institutional grammar. Same line of thought, actually. I was really excited to see that. So she was also trying to figure out like what are the building blocks of governance of institutions. So for example, one thing that really rings true for me that I'm thinking about, but this is really just still early stages, There's something to say about kind of having boxes for where things are happening. That's kind of the who decides what. And then what we decide is kind of semantics. So that's a thing. And what's really sweet is to think about this difference here. So that's my claim here. So I don't know if you know this kind of, this is something we see when patients have brain damage of a very particular kind. So they lose their capacity to form sentences. So when they, so they still can form words, but they can't form sentences anymore. So syntax gets lost while semantics is still there. Pretty fascinating stuff. So instead of what they want to say is, there are two books on the table, what comes out is something like that, because they lack the capacity to form it into something. And that is very much, honestly, how I experience a lot of interorganizational collaboration. There's a lot of talk of, let's do something together, but this doing something together somehow doesn't gel into, okay, and this is how it works, and here's how we'll go about it, and this is who's going to lead it, and these are the constraints, and that's how it happens. Right? We don't have that. We have that for internal organizations, but not for these kind of looser things. So that's why I've been thinking about this. And some of the things about organizational governance for me is that, of course, I want to use it with, or build it with the same design principles that I love inside of organizations. Like I want to have it consent-based, of course. And I want to have semi-autonomous teams, of course. So I want to reach scale, not through majority vote. That's not so interesting to me because of all the downfalls of majority vote. And instead, what I'm curious to explore is having like shared governance protocols and interoperability, not just on the metric side, but on the governance side. So how can we have a shared language about governance so that we more quickly can kind of go into collaborative mode and be clear about what that means? One side comment on that is that language in itself is already based on cooperation, right? So cooperation in itself is necessary, but it's not the only thing, right? So if you have language and like if you have words and the will to cooperate, you're still lacking syntax. You're still lacking the structure that puts it together into something that the other person can listen to and make sense of. So it's kind of, syntax is the vehicle by which you can even transmit meaning. And so cooperation, that's kind of something that I assume that it would be present, and at the same time, it's not going to be everything. You see this? So this is a slide that I've worked on with a client that was trying to figure out, well, now if we have 4 organizations that are all decentralized, how do we partner between them? What does that look like? And so what connects all of that? How do we do that? And they need that right now. So we were working on that, and we came up with the following design principles. So we came up basically governance protocols. And one of those parameters is that if you have a group, you need to distinguish there are 2 different groups. One is a decision-making group. The other one is just a communication or information sharing group. If you have a decision-making group, you have all the bells and whistles of that you would also have a sociocratic or holocratic circle. Like, you know where that group lives, you know what it's connected to, it has aims and domains, and it has an agreement with its members. And what those are is also fairly predictable if you know the work of pro-social, because you will need a way to be accountable, you need a way to have conflict resolution in place, and so on. If you have a communication group, then all you really need is some kind of shared understanding of what you're trying to communicate about and a place where you can host the whole thing. And by that, I mean kind of a not just, a place where you can meet, but I mean knowing who's inviting, basically, who's inviting this space. So now if we have collaborations, they can happen on several levels. Like you could have operations kind of on board level, right? That you could say, okay, we cooperate by always having somebody else on our board. Like we reserve a seat on our board for somebody from this organization and so on. You can have collaboration on a very project level oriented group. Like you can say, hey, we're trying to figure out this particular piece here. let's invite those two people in from that organization. They know about that and they know about that, and let's figure it out here. Let's do that together. What's not so common, and I don't think it should actually happen so often because of other reasons, is that we kind of go to the middle layers. I think it's best to do it at the top, like kind of on the outer surfaces of the organization. It's a little harder to rule into the inside of a decentralized organization, like kind of on that level. Anyway, but these are all spaces where people collaborate, which means they make shared decisions together. So these are then all these people from these other places would be decision makers in this space. And that's a key thing so that we know what's happening. And here, a board member obviously is also a decision-making member in that domain. Well, if we have communication, we use slightly different patterns. So we can still communicate that way, but maybe these people are just doing a survey or checking in with them or having a little retreat together where we're not making decisions, but we're just talking to each other. And in between teams, what we do is we have places where we can talk to each other, or we invite feedback in, for example. So these are all different ways of operating or of partnering that are not based on doing or deciding things together, but just on sharing information with each other. And that was the other thing that I also already mentioned about just inviting expertise in, but just as information, not as these people now being decision-making members in this space. So ultimately, where I want to go is I would like to figure out what those principles are that run everything. And these are the ones that I've come up with so far. So whenever we want to cooperate, both inside an organization and between organization, we will always have to have we have to follow the same protocols around communication and around governance. And some of those other things, other boxes we have to check as well. So basically, it's taking that interoperability topic that is kind of all around these days to take that to the governance level and say, okay, we need to speak the same language and use the same protocols so that we can collaborate without always having to reinvent our governance whenever we want to do something together. So my dream would be kind of having several sorts of protocols that maybe one can even fork and adapt. But basically, you just pick a protocol, and that's just how you do things. And it's flexible enough that everybody can operate with it given their context. Something like grammar, and you can still say whatever you want to say, right? It's not that we have to bend our grammar to say a new sentence. It just helps us get all those things out. It's just like governance principles would help us get the work out in the world that we want to do. So that's my stop. Actually, governance protocol. I'm looking for partners and people who would like to fund this kind of work. So if you have any idea of who would be excited about this, let me know, let them know. I would love that. And there we are.
So I'm going to take off the mute all. And I would love to have anyone in the audience feel free to ask a question. All you need to do is take yourself off mute. And I will also go to Meteor and look at the questions that are there and also add those in as well. So Ted, one of the first questions that you have is, how do we empower and support these communities to tell their own stories? How do we ensure we're not talking over them?
Can I hear the beginning of the question again?
It was, how do we empower and support these communities to tell their own stories? How do we ensure we're not talking over or for them?
Yeah, to me, I thought about this, and I think it's one of the pro-social principles that I'm kind of also basing this on, without having gone too much into detail about that, is the authority to self-govern. Like that to me is that I'm taking for granted, that people can have the authority to self-govern. They it starts with sovereignty, really, sovereignty for me. And then it's a big question what happens next, really, and that depends on where you want to go with this question. You know, it's kind of on the micro level of how do you have a meeting where everybody can be heard. That's where I spend most of my time in facilitation training. How do you design an organization where teams are on equal footing and no one team can overpower another team? That has to do more with structure and how you make decisions. So that's a wide question. That really goes from very small to very big. How much time or how much effort do you spend on systemic biases and so on? So like that's the very, very big frame. Curious which one you wanted.
So, John, do you have a question, since you thought it would be good to keep this discussion interactive?
Sure. Yeah, I thought since it was a small group, I thought Mentimeter might not make sense and we could just have a conversation instead of making it so formal. And actually, that's kind of the basis of my question. So I work for a Japanese company, a 96-year-old Japanese company. And you were talking about language, and I think you said language is based on cooperation. But I'd like to get your input on like the cultural difference of language too, because like with a Japanese language, there's the spoken word, but then there's also the intent or the meaning that is not spoken. And how does that fit into your work? Because it's not just language anymore, it's the whole aspect of communication. So I'd like to get your thoughts and input on that.
So so there's several things. I think I'm one level deeper than you are, and I don't mean that as a kind of a value statement, not at all. Just kind of on which level am I thinking about? Language is based on cooperation, because if you make your own grammar, make up your own words, it's simply gonna fall flat. Like, you know, we're gonna belly flop in our communication. So that's why people don't do it, right? It's because there's simply no point to it. Communication, I mean, language is used for communication. If you take the cooperation out of it, then it's just not gonna work anymore. So let's see. So then intercultural things. I mean, the language, kind of the syntax still works on the same principles, right? But that's not what you're talking about. You're talking about intercultural things. And I guess that's one of the things, I mean, that's always a question in all these Teal organizations, or the whole space of Teal organizations, right? Of how much is that culture, like how much is that human and how much is it very, very much based in kind of the Western world where it's talked about so much. I wonder about that in particular. For example, if you have cultures where people who, let's say, are older, like the oldest in the room, their voice has the most weight. Is that just something to accept, or is that creating a tension with now everybody's voice matters? I don't know what to say about that, but I know that's a tricky one. And I'm not sure I have anything interesting to say about kind of that language comparison on that area, but it's something I'm very familiar with organizational work. Yeah. So not so much there for me that I know of.
John, I'm curious about how you've had experiences working in a Japanese organization, and what sort of language challenges or collaboration challenges you might have experienced that might be interesting to this group and this topic.
Well, that's what I was trying to relate to. Like, I thought it was interesting when you were talking about like the linguist structure, like words and phrases and sentences and building that up. And then also about how, relating that at the organizational level. And I was trying to make that connect in my role as a Japanese company, because sometimes there's words and phrases and we can get that at the personal level or the team level. But if you're not getting the sentence structure or the intent or the meaning, how can you operate at that inter-organizational level? It's going to break down. And so that's what I was trying to get straight in my head, is how do you make that come together when you might not have those sentences and phrases understood correctly. So that's what I was trying to relate to.
Got it.
Ted, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess again, it's hard to kind of hit the right level or layer here where you are kind of where your interest is. On a language level, on a language level, there's a bunch of things that one can do there, but I think maybe the counterpart of that is value sets, right? And because values informing governance or informing decisions are always a little tricky as well, because they're so context dependent and they're kind of everywhere and nowhere at the same time. So that would be the counterpart, and that's, I think, just as hard in organizations as it is on the language counterpart. So yeah, another thing to pay attention to.
Well, and that's, when you were talking about governance, the word or what came into my mind was working agreement, because all those things are, like the principles, conflict resolution, accountability, how you're going to communicate, how you're going to measure yourself. All those to me were, at least in my vernacular, would be what's called a working agreement. And I think those types of things help, right? Because it helps with communication.
I noticed that Carol has her hand up. Carol, do you have a question that you might want to ask Ted?
Actually, is an offering of some kind, because I was thinking, I work on an organization here in Brazil that's been horizontal since '99, and create its own management model. And now we're making some transformations, but not in the core of the model. And this model, it has a process for decision making. And as it's horizontal, everyone can decide anything, anytime. It's open to anyone that works in this organization. And as it's a process, there's well, there are 4 steps. We have designed it now lately with these 4 steps, and it's interesting. I think it kind of answers some of the questions you were searching for in your work. And somehow, I don't know if I will be able to elaborate exactly, because it's a bit challenging. I'm a bit tired. English is not my mother language, but I'll try to explain a little bit of that, and wanted to know if I could help anyway with this. Sorry, talking like this, but well, and so this process is like, first step is you feel a tension, like a creative tension, just there's you realize that something's bugging you, or something you think you could change. And then the first step is to think about it, and if it's worthwhile changing something, a decision making. And then the second one, if you decided you want to go ahead, you can invite other people to form a group to help you craft a proposal. And this, we call it adequate group for consensus, because it is consensus based as an aspiration. But you will see that the 4 steps, they help achieve that. But obviously, we work with consentment, but we don't accept disagreement. And then the second, you invite people to craft this proposal with you, and it doesn't matter where is the home of that role. You know, we're working with roles now, so it can be from anywhere, any circle, anywhere in any point of the organization. And so you go ahead to the third step and you craft a proposal, and you have to collect data, facts, and really craft it. And the fourth step is like you give it visibility to everyone. So you have to have a channel where you can have this level of transparency. You just put it there, and then you say how long you will wait until you put it into action. If someone raises controversy in this period of time, you go back to the second step, and this person joins the group and helps craft a new proposal. So it's a loop, it's a circle. If no one disagrees, then it will go into action. It turns into a new reality. It's the new status quo, And so we call this Harambe decision-making process. And every decision in the organization is made like that. So in one side, we have the whole governance, who does what, is accountable for what, and it is located somewhere in the organization or in other organisms or organizations that work with that organization. And it is separated from, and the decision-making process, it's all over. It's not in a certain level, and you don't have to bring together people from the same level to decide with you. It can be anyone really who has something to offer, to contribute on that.
Carol, I'm sorry. I'm thinking that maybe this is a great conversation to have in spatial chat.
Sorry.
And it feels like it's also a great offer that you can make to Ted. Would you consider holding the rest of your thoughts and letting us get Dean's question in before we close out the session?
Oh, sure. I'm sorry.
Don't be sorry. I think what you're doing is fascinating, but I'm thinking that maybe we better get Dean's question in, and then let's go to spatial chat right after this, and we can have a longer dialogue if you're open to that.
Of course.
Okay, great. Dean, did you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Hey, thanks, Ted. That was really, really good. My mind's like buzzing with the metaphor of kind of, the comparing the evolution of organizations, and like you said, and going intra-organizational, with kind of that idea of language and complexity, and being able to do more the further you go along sort of that pathway. In some ways, I think that's a really helpful metaphor that I'm going to just take a bit of time to kind of download. I think my question is, when I saw your diagrams about sort of organizations and how they might be able to link together or sort of, share governance or sort of working in different ways. I had this with a client, which is that, once you move to a partnership approach where you're not competitors anymore, but you're actually, you can see other organizations as partners to help you along a journey. At some point that turns into conversations that you're not legally allowed to have, like collusion, like things like price setting. I mean, one of my clients is actually in a very, very hierarchical, like they do construction. So they're the bottom layer of the construction pyramid. And so they're consistently working against a culture of sort of oppression, where they're actually divided from everyone is made to compete. And, sometimes it's very hard for them to run the organization on the margins they have to run on in order to win work and things. And so one of the natural ways, once you start working in partnership with those above you, is also partnership with those around you. And so, but at some point that turns into collusion, which is actually, obviously it's meant to keep power in the hands of the people who are contracting, not the contractees. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts. That was just what jumped out to me when you looked at that in a commercial environment. So I'm wondering if you had any thoughts about sort of legal structures and things that sit around this.
Well, it's a known thing, right, that the legal and the financial system are stacked against decentralized organizations and collaboration. So yeah, that's tough. Yes, and that, I mean, one bumps into that wall all over, right? That's a very common thing. Also, I mean, we're not even the kind of the looser pattern of communication is allowed, like talking about, like making arrangements about where to price things and so on. That's not, yeah, anyway, but that's a problem. So this only works in collaborate, like in spaces where that is explicitly allowed. Yes. I'll stop there.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm with you. I feel like I have like follow-up questions, but I feel like they're going to get complex very quickly.
Yes, they do, especially because we're doing this thing, right? I mean, every Teal organization is kind of doing two things at once, right? Like trying to be in that old system and trying to be in the new system internally, and there's so many tensions around that. So yes, I'm with you on that one.
And I mean, like, it makes me wonder about sort of, one of the currencies in Teal organizations is trust, and yet our wider systems, like, again, showing what, like a lot of the people who come into the systems that I help build over here have trouble with sort of getting that trust part and how important that is. But I think it just, for me, goes to show like, what does trust look like between organizations? And you've got, the setting is that that's not actually allowed to some extent.
Well, and it appears sometimes that trust is such a range. I mean, fully trusting something and someone or some group, and trusting within legal compliance is a different story altogether.
Yeah, that's fun. Sorry.
So Ted, any closing thoughts that you would like to give us before we go to spatial chat and give Carol a chance to finish her story?
Sure, I guess just inviting people to think, to pay attention in particular to those little things. Like, I want to actually end on a story real quick. So just today, there was something that came up in Twitter of like a bunch of people wanting to work on the same thing. And the answer was, not in this particular case, but typically the answer is, oh, let's make a Slack channel, which is just information sharing, right? But it doesn't lead to a thing because there's no structure in place that actually turns that information thing into a doing thing. Because nobody is then empowered to say, okay, I'm gonna, call a meeting. I'm gonna call that. I'm gonna invite the people now. With kind of shooting ourselves in the foot over and over again because we're using patterns that are simply not fit for the task, and we do that a lot. And we would never do that inside of an organization because we've learned that lesson already. That you don't just do a Slack channel to, develop a new product. That's not quite enough, right? But we're not using it outside. So that's something to pay attention to. I've been really sensitive to that, and now I see it everywhere. And I'm complete. Thank you, everybody.